Violence is a huge challenge in our current society. Worldwide, we face the bitter situation of violent relationship on all different levels. Children grow up and they are raised in those bigger and smaller contexts, and many of them live violent lives at their home. Domestic violence is often related to other problems like poverty, addiction, exclusion, and so on. And often this violence is normalized as a form of parenting for children. So how do we prevent violence to raise children in a peaceful and a loving way? In this video, you can be part of the conversation between Harlene Anderson and Rocio Chaveste and the participants of the Mutual Learning Program about family and community-based care, where they reflect together on violence, what can be done differently from a collaborative and dialogical practice and perspective, and what different realities can be created with the children and their families. So enjoy the next video with Harlene and Rocio.
Let me just put in context. We have been talking about violence during all this process because as Helma was saying, it's very present in all the things that we have been working with children and family, and more in the way that they work as NGOs with them. But we have been reading in some point with many of them the book of Leonard, that it's called The Protective Interview, and it's talk about violence with children. And they talk a little bit about how to dignify each one of the members of the family and of the people that are with whom they are working. We have been talking a little very much about your philosophical stance, the collaborative dialogical practices. And we have been talking about examples of how we have been working with this philosophical stance in how do we position, how do we work, what do we think, how do we offer, how do we, and all of those things. So maybe I would appreciate that if you talk a little bit about the philosophical stance in general, and then maybe you can talk a little bit about what are your reflections of violence, of this big word that we have been listening every day and more in the world and in the families and everywhere. What are your reflections, and what do you think about what we can do with the philosophical stance of collaborative dialogical practice? So thank you, Harlene.
Thank you, Rocio.
I'm eager to hear you.
Okay, and I'm eager to hear all of you. So let me just say that historically, the group that I trained with and have worked with over so many years, the work was always with families, with children, and very often various kinds of violence were involved, whether that was physical, sexual abuse, or whether that was parents who were in prison or who had been abused themselves, whether there were drugs involved, whether people were in prison because they were stealing. So there were many kinds of very difficult life situations that children were living in. And I think one of the things that when Eve mentioned the teacher with the whip, that should remind us all of the importance of the adults in children's lives and how adults need to be considered in our work with children. That children, as you know in your work, are not just isolated little small adults, but they're very special, unique people who are still developing. And that each professional that they meet is a role model for them. And you never know the influence that you can have on a child. Let's see. There's a message that keeps coming up on my screen about translation. Sorry. Okay. So I know that just even thinking about collaborative dialogic practice and the philosophical stance can sound rather intimidating, can sound rather academic, and can sound rather, if you want to say, uppity. In other words, it doesn't sound like everyday, ordinary life. But what I have found over the years is that it's very connected to everyday, ordinary life and influences how we think of ourselves, how we think of the people we work with, how we think about what we do together, and particularly how we do it. So the philosophical stance is informed by several concepts, many of them very abstract and sometimes don't seem relevant, but there's a thread that runs through the ideas that inform the philosophical stance. And by philosophical stance, as you know, it refers to a position, an attitude, ways of being with other people and with yourself, both in your professional life and in your personal life. So it really requires to begin to, if you want to say, live the philosophical stance, really requires a mindset shift, a shift in the way that we think, which is so important. And I think that's the most difficult thing. You're familiar with some of the features of the philosophical stance. And the main feature, I think, is the whole notion of being with, doing with, talking with, and thinking with other people. And especially for those of you who speak English and Spanish, the word with, or in Spanish, the word con, is very, very important. And the whole idea that conversations and relationships go hand in hand. They connect with each other, they influence each other. In other words, the way that we begin to meet and greet and welcome the people that we work with begins to influence the way that we can be in relationship with each other, in conversation with each other, and what we can accomplish. And when I say what we can accomplish, I think part of the philosophical stance requires us to think modestly, to have modest expectations of ourselves, and to have modest expectations of the people we work with. And when I say the people we work with, I include children, the adults in their lives, and any way that you have any relationship or conversations with people who are in positions of power and authority, whether that's a politician, a doctor, a teacher, a principal, a priest, or a soccer coach. And that it's important to keep in mind that when we begin to work with various people, that when we meet them, they already have ideas about us. So we have developed reputations that, I will say, precede us, that come before us. That if you say a counselor or a teacher or a parent, as professionals, as everyday ordinary citizens, we have ideas about those people and what we do. So the most important thing, I think, in meeting the people we work with is to have them meet us as a unique, everyday, ordinary person, not as a professional with a lot of power and authority or a lot of expertise that you're going to try to pressure them with or try to put in their head, because we can't do that. So I think that's really important in thinking of trying to develop a relationship and be in conversations with other people. And this also influences the whole idea, as you know, of what in the philosophical stance is called the client is the expert, meaning that I would never want to think that I could be an expert on how another person should live their life. And I cannot be an expert on how you, each of you in your own countries, your own local situation, do your work. I can offer my ideas and what I think of as my biases. And when I use the word bias or prejudice, I think in terms of something, I will say more positive, that they are ideas, values, beliefs that I find helpful in my life and in my work. And certainly the client as the expert is an important one, that not only thinking of the child as the client, but the parents, the various other adults involved in their lives, whether those are grandparents, or aunts and uncles, or the teacher in the classroom. And it's very important, I think, if you ever have or can take the opportunity to meet some of the people influencing the child's life who are not in the counseling or therapy room or interaction with you. So this also requires taking extra time to sometimes go to schools to visit, to go to health clinics to visit, so that you are a visible person and people can get to know you as Ava or Poema. I'm looking at my screen. Rinaldo, Dorothy, Christian, or Eric, way over in Kenya. And I do want to say a special welcome to at least the two people from African countries that I see on my screen. Because when you talk about violence and violence in children's lives, it's not only in the homes, but it's in the places where we live. From the people at the very top, the politicians, those in power, the leaders of countries, and those of us who are more at the bottom. And again, to think in terms of who do you know that you can develop a relationship with, that you can be in conversation with. And it's just amazing that even if you're in a place like Kenya or a place like Ecuador or Mexico, that you will know someone who knows someone in a position of power or authority. It just takes being aware, listening and looking, being aware of what's in the newspaper, so that you can find any way to begin to have a relationship with someone in a position of power. And I focus on this because it is so important, because that's part of the context in which we work. And often in countries where there's a lot of violence, the violence is supported by people in power who are doing violent acts themselves, or by ignoring the violence in their own country or their own city. So before we started, Helma and Rocio and I were talking about the whole idea of cultures of violence, and how we do not want to participate in encouraging ourselves in our work cultures of violence by being violent with the people that we work with. And violence is not only something that you can see in terms of noticing a child with bruises or marks, or seeing a child being whipped by a teacher, but violence can be in the words that we use, the way that we use our eyes. Our eyes can say that we approve or we disapprove, or we like or we don't like another person. And I think what's most important for children is to work with adults who they feel really do like them. And to feel that someone really likes you, it's important to feel that you are respected. They respect you, they value you, and they believe you. Even if some of the stories are things that children tell us seem totally unbelievable, for a child, there's a reason for saying it. Again, thinking that this is part of their expertise in terms of how they live their life. And that also part of the philosophical stance is this very upsetting sometimes notion of not knowing, and how to think of ourselves as experts, but not experts in another person's life, but experts in how to develop healthy relationships with people, how to develop conversations where there's some possibility for something new or different to happen, and for us not to hold an idea about how that should be happening or what it might look like. That I have been so surprised over my many years, or I should say now decades, of working with children and families, of how they can be much smarter than I am, because they live their daily lives. They know the resources in their family, they know the resources in their community. And that's something that I will never know. So, Rocio, let me just pause and ask you to share what you're thinking, or questions you may have, or comments you would like to add to what I'm saying.
I was just thinking that it's a very difficult and challenging theme, because it's a big word, as I was saying at the beginning. And many times we have a prejudice basis about what is violence, and it has to do not just with the big idea of international way of thinking, but a very special way of thinking in each country and in each family and in each town. So sometimes we as therapists or facilitators, we think about violence in the big way of thinking, but we have to, as you were saying, always is to initiate a conversation thinking, start a conversation thinking that we don't know what is happening there. What do they call violence? What happened in their context? What is going on there? And how are the relations between the family and the community or in school or whatever, instead of just, oh, that's a family with violence, and then you just have to work with that big word, instead of trying to know a little bit more about how are they relating with each other, and how we would like to learn from them what is violence for them, in case it is the issue of the family or with the children, and with the NGOs or even the governments. Because for me, it has been a big word that really oppress ourselves, and they don't let us, and that do not let us think in a different way. So I think we have to learn with the families and the children, what does that word means, and what had happened in the relation, so we could start to talk in a different way about how do we relate, how can we do different things. So that's what I was thinking, and it's a challenge always to talk about the word.
And Rocio, maybe what you're saying is that we should try to delete or not use the word violence, because when we say violence and we're talking about children and families and communities, we are beginning to categorize people and see them as a member of a violent family, a violent society, a violent community. And that, I think, can make our work even harder, because dealing with violence sounds so overwhelming. And it is. And that's why I go back to how can we think more modestly? How can we think in terms of smaller goals for ourselves as professionals working with children and families? And how can we think of smaller goals for the people that we work with? Again, whether that's the child, the parents, the grandparents, the teacher, the priest.
Yeah, and also I was remembering that when sometimes that I had been working with people that are perpetrators in a way, you told me that I have to find what is the best or the good thing of that person to really can work with that person. Because if I have the prejudice about violence of the big word or whatever, and with a word that categorizes him or she, I wouldn't, it's very difficult to work with that because you have all the ideas or all the narrative about that word that you are using to name that person. And instead of that, I have learned from you is that I have to find out what else is not just that word that name it. It has a lot of possibilities, a lot of selves that I can find out to begin working with that person. So I was thinking that all those possibilities in our work, those of us who work with violence, the big word.
So, Rocio, I think what you're saying is so important. And when I say it very simply, I say, I think it is unethical to work with people you do not like. I say it is unethical because would you like to have a counselor or a professional helper trying to help you, but they're sitting there not liking you and thinking of you as this kind or that kind of person? So it's, as Rocio was saying, when you think of a person as coming from a violent background or as being violent, or you're thinking of them as another word I don't like, perpetrator of whatever kind of violence it is, that you begin to see that person as the label that you or that society or the culture has given them, rather than being able to see whatever it is, the value or the goodness that they can bring to their lives and to other people's lives.
Yeah.
That we, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Harlene.
No, you go ahead.
I was just remembering there's Pame, that is one person that is here. She works at Daniel Children Foundation, and she has a very good example that maybe she can share afterwards with us about children, teenagers that come from different countries and show her that they were really bad or whatever, but the relation he had with them helps her to learn from them and them from her. And it was just amazing, that situation. And I think she learned a lot, and she can relate with them in a different way. So were they a bad teenagers, or what happened in that relation that allows her to really like them and them to even protect her or trying to protect her. Mm-hmm. So it's just, I think that it's once again the idea of relating, and how do we construct, relate, or reflect on how do we would like to construct together a way of being in a different way. So I was just thinking about that. Maybe afterwards, Pame would like to share that example.
So many examples, I think, that each of us meet in our professional work, where we meet people who maybe the person who referred them or judge that mandates they come to meet with us have already been categorized as a violent person, or whatever word we want to use to describe them. It reminds me of one time that we were working and we were using the one-way mirror where you can be behind the mirror, but you can see through it, but the people in the room having the conversation cannot see you. We had a family that was referred where the father was a absolutely huge guy with just lots of extra body weight and fat kind of just hanging everywhere. And his nickname was Tiny, kind of a joke because he was not tiny. And the family had been referred because he had been abusing his children, physically abusing them. I do not think there was sexual abuse, but there was hitting and physical abuse and verbal abuse, calling them names and etc. And he began talking about how he didn't like people from a certain racial group. And it just so happened that one of those people from that group was one of the professionals behind the mirror listening to this. And she talked about how she was not judging him for his prejudice against her or people like her, but that was how he grew up, and that was part of the culture that he lived in, that he carried these racist ideas with him. But to make a long story short, they met briefly when they were leaving, and he ended up wanting to protect her, and he would call her Miss Harriet, and he would walk Miss Harriet at the end of every meeting, because the meetings would end when it was already dark. He would walk her to her car because he told her it was not safe for her to walk alone, and he didn't want anything to happen to her. And it was just, people's hearts just melted because they saw this very caring human side of a man that they had already decided was a monster. And I may not be able to tell the story in a way that you can be touched by the story, but it touched everyone who witnessed the relationship that this man began to develop with this woman who he had begun saying that he hated the race she belonged to.
That's a very good example. I really like it.
Yeah.
I was also thinking, Harlene, how they work in many NGOs, and they work sometimes with the government.
Mm-hmm.
So it's difficult sometimes to try to do it in the way that we work, having rules that we have to
Yes.
So sometimes what I was telling is, okay, we as relational ethics, that we have to talk a little bit more about the context where we come from, and then have a conversation in a different way so that they can feel in a very confident space. So what do you think, or what can you tell us about this space that we have to create, even though we work with government and with NGOs, please?
Well, I think it's very difficult when we work in these multiple contexts where each situation, each government, each level of government has its own expectations of us, its own rules for us. And I do think, of course, that there are some rules that we need to follow. But one of the things that my mentor, my supervisor, once told me, he said, Harlene, you have to remember that your boss, your supervisor, the head of the agency that you're working with does not need to know everything you are doing. So that means that I think we have to be very careful about how we talk about our work, how we explain what we're doing, how we're developing, how we're developing a relationship with the politician or with the person at the NGO. It's very, very, very important because they are in charge of the money. And if they don't give our organization money to operate, then we do not get paid. We cannot serve the children and families that we want to serve. So it doesn't mean that you have to do everything exactly the way they want you to do it, but that you have to keep in mind, and this may sound really sneaky, but you have to keep in mind that they can't know everything you do. They can't know all your deepest secrets or beliefs. They have to respect you as a professional, and they have to trust you. And trust is not a one-way street. Trust is a two-way street. So for someone to trust you, I think you have to show that you trust them. And so one of the things that I think about then when we go back to the philosophical stance is the whole notion of uncertainty and how uncertain life is, how uncertain relationships are, how unpredictable our work is, that we never quite know or can predict or can control what will or will not happen. So there's a lot of uncertainty, and that to keep in mind that you are not only influencing the people that you work with, but that they are influencing you. And to be aware of how the people you work with and the kind of work that you're doing influences you, and how heavy it must be. I cannot imagine in working with some of the children and families and in some of the situations that many of you work in every single day, and how you are able to go home and sleep at night and not take your work with you. Because we're human beings and our work is going to influence us. It's going to affect us. And it's going to influence our prejudices to be even stronger sometimes, particularly when we begin to categorize people or think of them as from a particular country or a particular race or a particular political position, a particular religion. Yeah.
I think it's very difficult to be always in the position of uncertainty
Mm-hmm.
and the not knowing position that it's at some point very, very close to. And I think that's why the philosophical stance, it's a way of being. So I was just thinking how can be, what is your advice for us to be in that position to work with a big word that it's named violence?
I think you have to value all the features or components of a way of being, or I say plural, ways of being and ways of becoming with another person. And to keep in mind of how we need to try to fit with the other person and not have them fit with us. Because I think mostly as professionals, we are trained to know how another person should be, how they should speak, how they should tell their story, how they should use their hands. And we cannot expect everyone to be and think like us, but how can we join them in their world, so to speak? It's very difficult to try to describe, but I often say, one time a psychiatrist asked me what I was talking about when I was talking about the philosophical stance. And I said, well, if I were to put it very, 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 very simply, it's having good manners. Now, what are good manners? They're different in different countries, in different cultures, they're different customs, but it has to do with how we begin to meet and greet, how we begin to engage, how we begin to talk with other people. Because we want to meet them and begin to talk with them in ways that they feel that we are respecting them, that they feel they can maintain their dignity, their pride, and that they feel safe with us. And feeling safe with us takes time. It doesn't happen immediately like that in the very first meeting or the very first conversation. Because the people who come to work with us, and hopefully we can help them, are not always there willingly. They do not always want to be with us. So that's something very, very important to keep in mind. We are not the friendly neighbor who brings him fresh bread every day or once a week. We are someone who has a reputation of having power and authority over them and their lives. And they see it every day in their lives. So they are suspicious of us. Of course they are. If I had to go to a court with a judge, I would be a little nervous and anxious. I'd be shaking a little because this is a person in power and authority, and I don't know what they could do to me.
Yeah.